Hi, everyone. Welcome to a Monday edition of Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds from Idaho News 6. Thanks so much for joining us here live across our social media platforms. As always, we're going to be talking about everything education going on in the state of Idaho. We'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions as I bring in Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Hello, Kevin. Thanks for joining me on Monday, since we know that Tuesday is going to be a bit of a nuts day in terms of covering news.
It's going to be the beginning of election week or election month or however long it takes to get some closure. Yes, it's going to be a busy day, no matter what happens on Tuesday. That's where all of our focus is going to be, and really where everybody's attention is going to be focused.
Well, and maybe we should start there in the sense
Sure.
that many times when it comes to election day, we talk about education, or we talk about what's going to happen with school districts if they have a levy on the ballot or a proposal of some sort. But this election is going to be pretty quiet.
On the education front, it is, but there are still some races that are worth keeping an eye on. Obviously, local races are not getting nearly the attention of the presidential race or even the congressional races. But there are a few local races that, if you're kind of pressed for time and you're wondering what to keep an eye on Tuesday night, there are a few that I would point to. District 15, which is a legislative district in West Boise. It takes in maybe a little bit of a sliver of the West Ada School District and the sliver of the Boise School District. This is probably the most hotly contested legislative district in the state. Democrats won the 2 House seats 2 years ago. They're hoping to get the Senate seat. Republicans are hoping to get those House seats back. Some fairly spendy legislative races going on there. One that really maybe even more interest on the education front, Steve Birch, a first-term Democrat from Boise who sits on the House Education Committee. He's being opposed by Patrick McDonald, former legislator, Republican, who had been the vice chair of the House Education Committee until he lost in the 2018 election. So that's a race worth watching. Really, all 3 of those races in District 15 are worth watching just because it's in such a competitive district. There are some other education committee members who have opposition on the ballot on Tuesday. There are also 3 races for trustee spots for the College of Western Idaho, and those are races that go across all of Ada and Canyon County. So a lot of people get to vote in these races. 3 trustee races, 2 incumbents who are seeking re-election, Skip Smizer and MC Nyland. You have 1 uncontested race. Mark Dunham, a founding member of the board, is retiring. Cherie Buckner-Webb, state senator from Boise, is running unopposed. So we know where that's going. The other 2 races, contested races. So just because of the size of CWI, its footprint, it's serving about 30,000 students, adults, and high school students across this valley, really huge impact, and a school that's facing some challenges because after years of rapid growth, they're actually seeing an enrollment decrease. So those are races worth watching. I know that everybody's attention is going to be paid, and everybody's focus is going to be the presidential race. Me too, of course. But there are some local races worth keeping an eye on, and we have a rundown of those at idahoednews.org, and we'll be focusing on those races and trying to give you real-time results in those races.
Don't you think, Kevin, and I'm just asking you to speculate here, so I understand that, but in your personal opinion, you've been covering politics in this state for literally decades now. Have you run across any stories or any thoughts about people paying more attention to local politics after going through a pandemic? And I know you said it best when you said everybody's eyes are going to be focused on the top of the ticket, on the presidential race, as well it should be. But when it comes to local politics, there's nothing pretty much like a pandemic to make people realize how much power is in their vote when it comes to trustee positions in school districts or at the College of Western Idaho or in their own legislative backyard.
I'm just going to be really interested, Michelle, in what we see on Tuesday when the polls open. I looked at some numbers that Ada County has posted on its website, and these are current figures. 170,000 people have already voted in Ada County. That's either voting by mail or early voting. 170,000, and let's contrast that to 2016, the last presidential election, you had just over 200,000 Ada County residents vote. So that's a huge number of early votes. And I don't think anybody really knows exactly what to expect when the polls are open on Tuesday. What sort of traffic do you see at the polls? What sort of, same day voting do you see? And, who knows what that means in terms of when we're going to get results, and what kind of election night we're going to have in Ada County, what kind of election night we're going to have around the state. I'm just really curious about that breakdown. I'm going to be really curious to see ultimately what the turnout turns out to be.
Well, so we do have some hard numbers when it comes to K-12 enrollment. And so I'd like to shift our focus there, and we can come back if people want to talk a little bit about local elections in a little while here on Making the Grade. Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. But we now have numbers in from across the state with how many kids are back in classrooms this fall. And I found this story fascinating, Kevin, because it's almost a tale of two stories, where there are fewer children enrolled in kindergarten through sixth grade and more children enrolled in the upper grades. So explain why these enrollment numbers are so telling this year.
Again, I'm just really curious about what we saw here. And overall, we did see a decrease in enrollment. We kind of figured that might happen. We kind of assumed that you were going to see some sort of a drop off, just because we would have parents decide to keep their kids at home, maybe do homeschooling in the middle of a pandemic, or enroll their kids in a virtual charter school. So what we saw was an overall decline in enrollment of about 4,500 students. But here, as we look at this story and you look at the numbers, the most sharp decreases in enrollment took place in the elementary school grades, especially kindergarten. That's a drop of 1,100 kindergartners. And I don't think we know, and I don't think we can know, how that's going to play itself out in years to come. Are those parents going to bring their kids back into schools? Are they going to enroll those students in first grade? Is this just a blip that something that changes if we head into 21-22 school year and the coronavirus pandemic has we've gotten it under control, we've got vaccines, we've got case numbers stabilizing. We don't know. We don't know what this is going to look like. So crunching those numbers this week and getting a sense of what's happening right now, it really just sets the table for us. It really kind of sets the stage for stories that we're going to be watching in the next few months, in the next couple of years.
Kevin, if people are looking at these numbers at idahoednews.org, and great story, great reporting done by the whole team there, if people wanted to, where do you get these numbers from? Where do you get your data? And how do we know exactly where a student went? If you say that there are fewer kindergartners, as we well know now, who have joined the traditional K-12 system, do we know where they went? Is there any tracking?
We don't know where every kid would have gone. So we don't know how many kindergartners are homeschooling, because there are not there is no data as far as homeschooling. We can get the data as far as online charter enrollment, and that was an increase across the board. We did see more students in virtual charter schools. Again, as you would expect that some parents would say, in the middle of a pandemic, I'd feel more comfortable keeping my kid at home. I'd feel more comfortable having a stable learning schedule, even if it's not really what I want, even if I'd really rather send my kid to a face-to-face school. At least I know what's going on here. I can plan around this as best I can. We kind of figured all of that would happen, but this sort of quantifies it. But to answer your question, these numbers come from the State Department of Education. These are their preliminary enrollment figures, and we usually get a better sense of these numbers, more updated numbers, as the school year goes on.
Has there been any worry, and I know that in the piece itself, you talked with Beth Oppenheimer, who is the president and CEO of the Idaho Association for the Education of Young Children. Of course, she also sits on the Boise School District board. So she has kind of an inside look into what's happening within the schools, but also with young learning. And I know she's always had concerns about kindergartners, and she made that concern known again in your piece about where are these kids, and do we know if they're even going to school? Because of course, in the state of Idaho, kindergarten is not required.
It's not required, so I don't really know what's going to happen with these kindergartners in first grade and beyond. But we do know that we've seen a significant drop off in the number of kids who are enrolled in kindergarten, and it's obviously connected to the pandemic, and it's obviously connected to parents who are concerned about sending their kids to school in the middle of a pandemic.
The other thing that we have seen is that we've gotten the Idaho Reading Indicator scores back. This is the reading test that's given to kindergarten through third graders. And when we say reading test, we always have to make sure that you understand that it's not asking if a kindergartner can read. It's asking for a kindergartner if they're prepared and have the skills to get ready to read.
Exactly.
And that's true all the way through. And once again, probably not a shock to anybody, but the scores on the Idaho Reading Indicator this year lower, as we would probably expect after so many kids lost so much ground last year.
Right, lowest scores since 2015. And what I think is significant is to look at where the drop-offs took place, because as you scroll down in the story, we have some really good graphics that show you what happened. As you can see here, it's busy, but this is a really informative graphic. The kindergarten scores didn't really change all that much from 2019 to 2020. Kind of makes sense when you think about it. I mean, this is measuring how prepared kindergartners were a year ago, as opposed to the kindergartners who did show up, and how prepared were they this time around. Really not much of a difference. What you do see, and where you do see the drop-offs, are in first, second, and third grade. This year's first graders, this year's second graders, this year's third graders, not scoring as high as their predecessors a year ago. So what that suggests to you, and again, not a surprise, but it gives you a sense of the challenge that schools and teachers are dealing with right now. When kids had to stay home, and when we went to online learning in the spring, that apparently had a pretty profound effect on how prepared these kids were when they went back to school in the fall. How reading ready were first graders? Where were the reading skills for second and third graders relative to how their predecessors did a year earlier? You see drop-offs of several percentage points across the board in first, second, and third grade. And let's backtrack and remember what this test is all about, why this test is administered in the first place. It's designed to be a screener. It's designed to be a diagnostic test. And what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to give reading teachers a sense of where their students stand, especially right now in the beginning of the school year. Where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses? Where should a teacher focus the instruction? And how should a teacher tailor the instruction for a student who's not reading at grade level and is at risk of falling behind? That's what this test is all about. That's the importance of the test. So what it's telling you and what it's telling teachers is there's considerable work to be done this year. Again, not a surprise, but it gives you a sense of the task.
One of the interesting parts of this story, Kevin, that I appreciated is if we scroll down just a little bit more, there's also a list here of some of the top schools, the best schools coming in with their reading scores. And what I found unique about this, as it points out in the story itself, is that charter schools in particular, public charter schools, did incredibly well when it came to the top result getters.
Right. And again, this is not something we are that surprised to see. This isn't something that hasn't happened before. Charter schools do tend to score higher in a lot of tests, including the IRI. And, it kind of just goes into the debate about charter schools, doesn't it? I mean, the debate about, is it the demographics of the students coming into these charter schools, or are there other factors going on? As I always say about the IRI, and especially the IRI at the kindergarten level, all it's really doing is giving you a sense of how prepared that student is. It gives you a sense of what has been going on in that young kid's life heading into kindergarten. How prepared are they for kindergarten? It really has nothing to do with the school that they happen to enroll in. It has everything to do with the home environment, has everything to do with, do parents have time to read with their kid at home? Do they, expose their kid to reading? Do they have a home life where kids spend time with books? That's really what the IRI measures, especially at kindergarten. And, so again, what we're seeing with the charter schools, not really a surprise. We've seen this kind of gap between charters and traditional schools before. And the debate is, why and what does that say about charter schools as opposed to the traditional schools?
And moving forward, Kevin, what I'm going to be curious about is you mix the two stories we've just been talking about. So you mix this year's low enrollment rates, especially when it comes to kindergartners, with low reading scores. And that doesn't necessarily add up for a good recipe for next fall. So what people have, specifically teachers and schools, have cut out in front of them only shows probably an uphill battle.
Yeah, what we don't know and what we'll really want to watch for next year is, what do those fall reading scores look like? We don't know where we're going to be in terms of the pandemic, but we do know that if we've had 1,000, 1,100 fewer kindergartners show up in school this year, and some of those kids show up in first grade, and they've been, in a homeschool environment, or they've been, kept at home, out of safety concerns in the middle of a pandemic. How prepared are those first graders? And what happens with first grade scores that we see next fall, as opposed to the first grade scores that we saw this year, which already reflected a drop? So a lot we're going to want to watch here. A lot we're going to want to analyze as we get a new round of numbers. And again, with the IRI, we're going to be very curious to see what we get in the spring, because you do see improvements, obviously, from the fall to the spring. These scores will go up. The question is, how much do they go up, and how do the spring scores this year compared to what we've seen in previous years? Because we didn't get those spring scores last year because schools closed down and went online. So we'll get some spring scores, and we'll have to go back pre-pandemic to see how they compare.
I want to bring in Nicole because she's just making your exact comment here. But Nicole, we're hearing you. Home environment is a huge part of how students test on the IRI.
Absolutely.
Without a doubt. Agree more. So let's also turn to another story at Idaho Education News that got posted in the last week, which is that we now have numbers again on how teachers are doing, teacher evaluations, because teachers have to go through a process for a pay for performance, and we can talk a little bit about that. There are 4 categories that a teacher can be graded on, so to speak, those being unsatisfactory, basic, proficient, and then distinguished. And it certainly looks from these marks that Idaho has some pretty great teachers.
What the numbers say, and this is why we've tracked these numbers for the past 5 years, is to give a sense of how are schools assessing their teachers, and what kind of reports are they turning into the state. And as you can see, the numbers that were turned in this past school year, 98.5% of teachers received one of the top 2 evaluation scores. So, that's the highest percentage we've seen as we've been tracking these numbers for the past several years. These numbers have always been up around the 97 to, well, now 98.5% range. And why do these numbers matter, and why do we pay so much attention to them? These numbers are a linchpin for the teacher salary raises that we've been awarding for the past several years. The evaluations play right into eligibility for pay raises under the teacher career ladder. So the numbers that the districts are turning in, the scores that the districts and the charters are turning in, have a direct relationship to what happens with teacher salaries.
Were you surprised by these, Kevin? And on that note too, we should let people know that there is a factor of student achievement that goes into awarding teachers their top marks as well, which that will be fascinating to see as we move forward through the pandemic, how that works.
No, I wasn't terribly surprised by these numbers either, because as I said, we've been tracking this since 2015, and we've seen similar patterns. We've seen, 97% or more teachers receiving one of the two top marks. So no, not really a surprise, but something we continue to want to track. And we were just curious to see, would anything change in this round of scores in light of the pandemic? But evidently, not really much of a change.
Let's move to teachers at a higher level. Boise State, specifically this week, having some conversations last week and this week about faculty furloughs. And we've been reporting on this since last spring, when Dr. Marlene Tromp at Boise State was already not only hinting, but sending out letters to staff saying they would have to take time off over the summer. And it depended exactly what you did at the university, how much you got paid, how much time you have to take off. But once again, Boise State is starting to talk to its faculty about the fact that furloughs are coming.
Yeah, and this time around, these are furloughs that target faculty. The first time around in the spring, Boise State did have furloughs, but it was for staff. It was for folks who work year round, as opposed to faculty members who are on contracts of 9 months out of the year or 11 months out of the year. So it gets kind of wonky. But the point of the matter is, this time around, the furloughs are going to affect faculty, and the university is hoping to save about $1.1 million by furloughing faculty. The mechanics are still in progress, and the timetable is still in progress. And the university had some town hall meetings with faculty last week to talk to them about their questions and their concerns about the furlough plan. I should note that I wanted to sit in on those town halls because I really wanted to hear what the rank and file faculty were saying, and I still do want to hear from rank and file faculty. We were refused. We were not allowed to sit in virtually on those meetings. So I wasn't able to hear that, and I really did want to hear that. But what I did hear from the president of the Faculty Senate is, there are some concerns, as you would expect. And part of the concern is, well, how are we going to juggle this? How are we going to make this work as far as our schedule is concerned? Because one thing Boise State has been very clear about with these furloughs is they don't want it to affect instruction. A professor cannot call off a class because he or she is taking a furlough day. That's just not how it's going to work. So faculty is going to have to find other things in their schedule to set aside in the name of furloughs. That may be research, that may be strategic planning, which is a big project right now at Boise State. So there's that concern. And there are also questions, as I talked to Amy Vecchione, the president of the Faculty Senate, there are concerns about the timing of all of this, because professors are being asked to take furloughs at a time when the state is running a pretty large budget surplus, and a budget surplus that's not really being used to offset state spending cuts in higher education. So I think the timing of all of this and the impact on faculty, that's got, some professors asking questions. But again, we don't really know when this is going to roll out. We don't know how long it's going to roll out. We don't know how it's going to be done mechanically. But, similar furloughs have been put in place at University of Idaho and Idaho State University. And, again, this all goes back to the pandemic, and it all goes back to the cash flow issues that the universities have been facing because of the pandemic.
Well, and you hit on it there, but as people at home could understand, obviously Boise State had to spend money to get ready for this year, to make things changes, hire new people because of the COVID-19 crisis. You also understand if you're... Mm-hmm. You could also understand if you're on the outside looking in that if you don't have a football season, you lose a whole lot of revenue. But balance that out again, Kevin, with what you were saying with our state supposedly having at least what's projected to be like a $500 million surplus. The two don't seem to go hand in hand. So why are faculty at Boise State or University of Idaho or Idaho State University, if they're all doing some sort of furloughs with their faculty, why are they taking the blow here?
Well, the furloughs that have gone on already you're going back to the spring. You're going back to when the campuses were closed, and instantly the universities had a revenue crunch. Had to refund room and board. They had to, cancel events, what have you. Millions of dollars of lost revenue for the universities. That's the backdrop as Boise State did the staff furloughs back in the spring, and those went into effect in the summer. This whole thing with the surplus is a more recent development. I mean, just in the past few weeks, Governor Little has talked about, the size of the surplus, and that tax revenues are coming in ahead of projections, and that the state has had other savings, including these budget cuts. I mean, you get to the $500 million surplus in part through the budget cuts that have been put in place, including the budget cuts for higher education. So it's a really complicated, bit of accounting that's going on here that gets you to a $500 million surplus. But the bottom line is, instructors are asking, well, why now? And why, when we're sitting on a surplus, why now?
Let's turn to some really good news when it comes to Boise State. Besides football, which I'm sure everybody is excited about, we wish we could tailgate. But besides that, we understand where we are in this day and age. But campus coronavirus cases, something you are now tracking every single week at idahoednews.org if you want to see the exact details and numbers. Kevin, again, things continue to be on the positive side of coronavirus on campus, and this just makes me thrilled.
In contrast to what we're seeing with coronavirus cases and coronavirus deaths statewide, this is looking like a positive trend and a continuing trend. We've seen decreases in coronavirus case numbers at U of I and Idaho State over the past couple of weeks. Boise State, their numbers have been kind of stable for the past 3 weeks, and they saw a drop off last week, 43 new cases. That's the lowest number of new cases at Boise State in the past 7 weeks. So, there was a lot of concern going into this fall semester about trying to keep coronavirus in check so that we can continue with face-to-face learning. And as we're heading into the colder weather, and as we're heading into the end of the fall semester, which really will come around Thanksgiving, the trends are moving in the right direction. And a lot of the metrics that we've been watching really closely are trending well. It's not just the number of cases at Boise State University, it's the number of students who are in isolation beds. The university has, I want to say, a little bit over 150 isolation beds for students who test positive. As of Friday, only 10 of those 153 beds were being used. So, you don't want to see an outbreak, obviously, but in the event that there was an outbreak or an uptick in cases, Boise State would have quite a bit of space to isolate students, to get them some care and get them, get them away from other students, so you can kind of keep them isolated and prevent a further outbreak. So a lot of trends moving in the right direction on campuses right now.
That is great news, and a good way to end Making the Grade with all of the education numbers that we've thrown at people today.
And when I've been writing so many sobering tweets and so many sobering blog posts about the coronavirus case numbers statewide, yes, it is a glimmer of hope. And it was something that Governor Little brought up a few days ago in a town hall with AARP Idaho, saying, well, if the campuses are figuring out how to do this, it might be a model for the rest of the state. Also worth noting, though, that the universities have very stringent mask requirements for students. They also do some very aggressive testing. Part of the reason why U of I has been able to get its coronavirus outbreaks in check was that they instituted pretty much campus-wide testing on all students over the past few weeks to really get a handle on the situation. Testing has been a challenge in the general population, but on campuses, they've had a lot more testing capacity, and that's certainly been a factor.
Would be nice to see the campuses leading the way. They've been pushing for this since back in March, when they knew that they would have to do everything they could in order to reopen and not be those super spreader situations. So that's good news. And of course, over at Idaho Ed News, Kevin, you will continue to follow these caseloads week by week, and people can go to idahoednews.org to get caught up on those numbers or any of the numbers we've talked about here. If you want to see some of those graphs on low reading scores, or if K12 enrollment is your thing, all of those stories are posted at idahoednews.org. And I have to say,
we'll have some election numbers too. So come Tuesday, Wednesday, as we get those, we'll post some numbers there as well.
Lots of stats, but a lot of heart with stories as well. So I appreciate that from the staff over there. Okay, it is show and tell time, my friend. Like we always like to end Making the Grade, so that Kevin can have a little bit of time to share something personal with all of us, but especially me, since we are virtual. And we've done everything, Kevin. I mean, it started with a socks segment and has continued much further than that. So what are you bringing on this day before Election Day, my friend, as your show and tell?
It's got nothing to do with elections, but it does have to do kind of with where my mind is and where the calendar falls. So, and I think you saw this one 4 years ago. So 4 years ago this week, I was in New York running the largest marathon in the world, the New York Marathon, which did not happen this year. Big races are on hold because of coronavirus for obvious reasons. You don't want thousands of runners in close contact with each other. You can't have millions of spectators as New York draws every year. So obviously I'm thinking about where I was 4 years ago, what I was preparing for 4 years ago, and thinking about the folks who had planned to do this year and had to do it differently. You had runners across the world doing the 26.2 miles virtually, and I can't imagine the discipline that takes. I mean, at least when I've done this before, you have the energy of the day. You get to feed off of the energy of being around other runners, and you get the energy from the spectators who spend part of their day watching slow runners like me. To do this solo and to train and do this solo, my hat's off to everybody who did that. I have extra respect for anybody who could do that under those circumstances, and hopefully we'll all be doing this face to face. Those of us who do this kind of thing, we'll be able to do this face to face again when we get on the other side of this pandemic.
Kevin, I wish you could be there running this year.
I've always kind of thought maybe it was a one and done, but I don't know. It was a very special day because you run through all 5 boroughs, and you do have about 1 million spectators from the beginning to the end. Just playing music and cheering and holding up signs. It's just a wonderful event and a great way to see the city in a different way. And
that finish in Central Park. You can't get any better than that.
Yes. Yeah. I still get a little bit misty thinking about it. It's very cool.
Well, Kevin, we appreciate all you do for our community. Thank you for your coverage of education and politics and covering a pandemic as well. And buddy, we hope you will get to run New York or Boston or Chicago or someplace maybe next fall.
Like a run race in Boise one of these days again. I'm missing that. I mean, we'll get on the other side of this thing. I'm confident.
Everybody, thank you for watching Making the Grade, Idaho News 6, and of course, Idaho Education News will have complete election results as they start to come in tomorrow evening. I hope you'll join us for all of that. Kevin, we'll be back next week, Tuesday, for Making the Grade.
Yeah. Have a good week. Thanks for having me.